All right, we're finishing up the final couple of questions on our Lot notes, and then we'll be getting into Melchizedek. So the last three questions on our notes, the third to last, why do you suppose Lot was drinking so much? Of course, we looked at the account in Genesis where after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, what all happened with Lot and his daughters. Why do you think Lot was willing to drink so much? It makes you wonder if there, even though the grief, it makes you wonder if there's some emotional turmoil taking place. Especially given the fact that, of course, we don't have the full picture of his life, but I don't think that this was a regular occurrence for Lot, that Peter would go on to call him a righteous man or a just man. There are repeated calls in both the Old and New Testaments not to become drunk with wine. And so the fact that Lot allowed himself to drink so much that he was basically passed out drunk, that kind of speaks to the depths that he went. And it may, even though the context doesn't give us the commentary on Lot's emotional state at that time, but you got to figure, his entire place where he lived is gone, and his wife is now dead, and it's just him and his daughters. And so I imagine he's in a bit of emotional distress. And as we mentioned last week, what a stark example, or really a stark contrast between Job and how Job handled the news of his children being killed and his livestock being taken away and his servants being kidnapped, compared to Lot. Now, obviously, that's not to say that Job was more righteous than Lot or anything like that. We're not comparing in terms of who was better, because that's not how that works. But at the same time, we can certainly see examples where we have individuals who handle things the right way, and then we have examples where even good people, righteous people, may handle things the wrong way. And I don't think it'd be too much of to go out on a limb here and think that at the very least, Lot's judgment was compromised because of what he'd been through. And so he allowed himself to get so drunk twice in a row that those things that happened ended up happening. Thoughts or comments through that? Second to last, why do you suppose Lot's wife looked back? Even though they were told by the angels, do not look back, by the time they got close to Zoar, she was looking back. And I think there are two valid possibilities here. Obviously, the text, again, doesn't tell us exactly what was in her mind when she looked back. One, and sometimes what's generally attributed to her, is her desire to not, the fact that she was not willing, she didn't want to leave. She didn't want to go leave everything behind. That her heart was still back in Sodom. And that could be, it's possible. Again, we're not given that explanation here. Could also have been the fact, you've got fire and brimstone raining down from heaven, destroying multiple cities. All the area of the plains south of the Dead Sea are just decimated. I imagine that was certainly terrifying, but I imagine it was literally an awesome sight. But it was very, just being in awe of the power of God, being in awe of the judgment of God. I'm sure the instinct to look and see what was going on, I'm sure they heard some of it as well. It probably wasn't something that was just complete silence if fire and brimstone was coming from heaven and destroying these cities. So it could be that, as many commentators have proposed, that Lot's wife, she was unwilling to leave, and her heart was still back in Sodom, and so God destroyed her for that. Obviously, she disobeyed the commandment. That's why she was turned into a pillar of salt. The commandment was, don't look back, and she did. As to why, we don't know. But in the end, I think that even better makes the point that, is there any good reason to break the commandment of God?
I think, Michael, like we do, we lose focus.
You lose focus, yeah. Yeah, and maybe she was in an emotional state.
Even though she didn't want to leave, there's things we don't want to do sometimes.
Sure.
But we still have to command,
Yeah.
obey the commandments.
And we talked, we talked about Uzzah last week.
It's natural.
Yeah, his natural instinct to study the Ark of the Covenant. You're right. I think, whether regardless of what her character, her attitude was regarding Sodom or whatnot, she lost focus. She did not obey the commandment of God. And in a very, very clear way, obviously Lot and his daughters were reminded of the commandment of God when his wife was turned into a pillar of salt. Anybody else? Dylan?
Within the context that we've looked through, verse 15, 16, 17, it's the next morning. The angels show up. They are hastening them. Get out here quickly.
Yeah.
They're kind of lingering. Take them by the hands. Drag them out of the city. Go. Escape for your life.
Yeah.
It would seem to be, in that immediate context, she's looking back. My life is this and here. And they're saying, life is on the go. It's somewhere out there. If you
Right.
And that seems to be, to me, the strongest within the scriptures. What it does tell us,
Yeah.
she's still looking back.
She's still looking back. And a lot of times we draw that kind of a parallel, that we not look back. Jesus himself, several times, he talks about the man who lays his hand to the plow, looking back. I think he makes that case. You go forward, you keep plowing ahead, you don't look back. There's several different analogies throughout the New Testament regarding that. And so certainly, that's a lesson we can gain from that.
Certainly, I think you started to touch on, or somebody to stereotype women are usually more emotional than men are. She has lost everything that we just said Lot has lost.
Yeah.
As far as possessions, house, everything in it, maybe some more children, their sons-in-law.
Right.
All this stuff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it could very well be that in that she, in her emotional compromised position, she looks back because she's thinking about all that stuff and not thinking about the commandment of God. And of course, Lot's compromised as well, which we end up seeing. I think that's a fairly sound connection to make as to why he allowed himself to get so drunk. Yeah. Anything else? Yes, ma'am.
It ended up being a good lesson through the ages.
Oh, yeah.
For all of us. No matter what your temperament is, you still should obey.
That's right.
The command.
Well, and that has stood, as so many examples have, throughout the generations, because God's word has recorded it for us. We talk about Lot's wife and the pillar of salt. We reference that on a fairly regular occasion. And it always is at least a monument in our mind, a memorial in our mind of the dangers of not obeying the commandment of God. No matter what the reason was. There is never a good reason to disobey the commandment of God. And certainly the loss of focus, the compromised emotions, whatever the case was, is still not an excuse to disobey the commandment of God. And that's true for both Lot and for his wife. Yeah.
Whatever it was some kind of an attachment.
Yeah.
Whether it was family, the life, the house.
One would think.
The people,
Yeah.
Whatever it was.
Yeah.
And maybe we've got to examine ourselves and make sure there's not some attachment that we all have. We all have attachments. We
Yeah.
all have something that's important to us. And we got to be careful that doesn't change our judgment on whether we do what God says or we do what seems to be important to us. We need to look at the big picture type thing. It can happen to any of us.
Yeah.
With whatever, Satan knows where our weaknesses are.
Absolutely. And there's tons of members of the church who have allowed themselves to become compromised. Had they stood for the truth at one time and then something's happened to themselves or to their family member, and now all of a sudden, because it's personal and it's real to them, now they go through the scriptures looking for justification for either something they're going to do or have already done. And it's amazing how things like that will change the mind of somebody from doing what's right to then seeking some kind of a proof text or an excuse text as to why it's okay to do it now or okay not to do this. But there have been many Christians, many members of the Lord's body who've allowed things like that, attachments, particularly relationships, to cause them to compromise God's word. And I think that's a valid application to make from both the examples of Lot's wife and Lot. Yeah. Which kind of leads us to that final question: what characteristics should we want to imitate or not imitate from Lot? Obviously, when we are in states of emotional compromise, and there's going to be times where we're upset, there's going to be times where we are sad, where we are grieving. There's going to be times when we are emotionally compromised. That's just the nature of being human. But we cannot allow our compromised emotions to lead us to turning our back on God's word. Either to cause us to do something to kind of drink it away, as Lot may have kind of thought to do, to deaden maybe what he was feeling, the terrible sorrow maybe that he was going through. Whatever the case was, we have to make sure that, especially in those moments, we follow the example of Job, where Job, he immediately sat down in dust and ashes and prayed to the Lord. He worshiped God. Even though he was in deep distress, in his deep distress, who is the best comforter? God is. His word. God and his word are the best comforter there is. And that's how Job handled that. And I think that's a good contrast to see. What else about Lot would we imitate or not imitate?
From Peter's writings, don't use the flimsy excuse, the people around me made me do it. He was righteous, even though his soul was vexed by all the ungodliness in that city, in that area. You can still do what's right.
That's a great example. As Peter acknowledged that this was a righteous man, even though he was hearing and seeing the wicked deeds of the people of Sodom every day, he still, based on what Peter says, he still was righteous. Okay, he did not participate, and I'm sure that given the way these individuals of Sodom acted toward these visitors, I'm sure there were times where Lot or his family were pressured, whether you want to call that peer pressure, societal pressure, whatever you want to call that. I'm sure there were times, and of course we know just by the statements of these men of Sodom, they give the impression that this has happened before. He continues to be a judge over us as if he has either said or done things before that has pointed out their wickedness. And so it's not like this was the first and only time that this may have happened, at least in terms of this contrast between Lot's righteous life and the sinful nature of the people of the city. Maybe perhaps this particular event, that may have been the first time. But regardless, that would be definitely, especially for us in a society which, as we look around us, we think of the sin that's being tolerated, that's being accepted, and the effort to force others to accept the sinful nature and sinful deeds and so forth. The attempt to force us to say it's okay and everybody's fine. Sometimes those parallels, we can see those parallels with what people at that time, maybe not quite to that extent, but people like that had to deal with as well. And Lot was able to rise above that and remain faithful to the Lord in his conduct. Anything else about Lot? Okay. All right, we'll stop there. We could keep going. We could keep talking more about Lot, and there are other specifics that we could talk about, but we've spent 2.5 classes on Lot. So we're going to move on to Melchizedek. So we're going to go to our notes on Melchizedek, and we are going to start here in Genesis chapter 14. We actually looked a little bit at Genesis 14 in our study of Lot, and how that Lot was taken captive after some individuals were, the king of Sodom and a couple of the other kings of the plains were rebelling against Chedorlaomer, or however you pronounce his name. And so we see starting in verse 18, this is as Abraham is coming back after having been victorious and so forth. We see verse 18, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And he gave him a tithe of all. Now the king of Sodom said to Abram, Give me the persons and take the goods for yourself. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, I have raised my hand to the Lord, God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing from a thread to a sandal strap, that I will not take anything that is yours, lest you should say, I have made Abram rich, except only what the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men who went with me. And then he names them and their portion. We see how, and of course this is the king of Sodom here in verse 17, who's coming out to meet Abram after Abram has successfully gotten Lot and everybody back. Melchizedek goes out and greets Abram as this meeting is going to begin. But Melchizedek doesn't sound like he has any dealings with the king of Sodom, only dealings with Abram. And we see what Melchizedek says to Abram. Blessed be Abram of God Most High. And he specifically refers to God Most High being the possessor of heaven and earth. And it's interesting that Abram then mentions that himself in verse 22. I've raised my hand, which is, he took an oath or took a vow to the Lord God Most High, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will take nothing. It's kind of interesting how Abram basically quoted that same thing that Melchizedek said. But we're talking about Melchizedek. We see specifically that Melchizedek, verse 18, the king of Salem. The king of Salem. Do you know what Salem was? It was the name of Jerusalem before it became taken over by David and the Hebrews. Before it became Jerusalem, it was Salem. So this man, Melchizedek, not only was he king, but what else was he? He was a priest of the Most High God. Under what law? Patriarchal law, or whatever you want to call the law that Abraham was under. We call it the patriarchal law, for lack of a better phrase. But this was before the Mosaical law. So before the law that we have that details the tribe of Levi, that details the workings of the tabernacle, all of that, there was a priesthood that existed under the law before it, under the patriarchal law. Do we have the details of the patriarchal law about its priests, about how they were to worship? I mean, we know sacrifices were involved, we know that much, but in terms of the specifics as it's laid out in the Mosaical law, we don't have that information. We don't need that information either. But it's enough to know that there was a law. There has always been law. Man has always had the means to know how to serve God since Adam and Eve. But there was a law that incorporated priests, but the fact that he was a priest and a king is significant. Okay? But we only have this little section, verse 18 through verse 21. Now, verse 18 through verse 21, we're not there. You would have verse 17, here comes the king of Sodom to meet him at the valley of Shaveh. And then verse 22, Abram said to the king of Sodom, I've raised my hand, and so forth. Or really verse 21, the king of Sodom said to Abram. You have verses 18, 19, and 20 there only telling us about this random meeting between Abram and this man named Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem at the time, and also a priest of God. Very odd, very strange. Kind of just random in the middle of nowhere, all of a sudden, this is recorded. But it's vital, it's important. In fact, the Hebrew writer is going to really base almost the entire book of Hebrews on that point. in Hebrews chapter 7. And we see this being Melchizedek mentioned one or two other times in the Psalms specifically. But then in chapter 7, the Hebrew writer earlier, he says, there are other things that I need to talk about, things like Melchizedek and so forth, but you become dull of hearing. He mentions that back in chapter 5. So then he gets to chapter 7, where he's finally going to be able to go over this stuff. And he says here in chapter 7, for this Melchizedek, and he even mentions it here, I believe at the bottom of chapter 6, talking about Jesus being a hope as an anchor for the soul, verse 19, verse 20, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. And he's going to quote the actual psalm that references the order of Melchizedek. So now the Hebrew writer wants to talk about Melchizedek. He says, this Melchizedek, king of Salem, that's exactly what we read back in Genesis 14, priest of the Most High God, that's exactly what we read back in Genesis 14, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated king of righteousness, and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. Very interesting. So the name Melchizedek itself means, in Hebrew, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. But then the fact that he's referenced as king of Salem, what does the term Salem mean? Or what does the term Salem, what does the term Salem mean? It means peace. That's why the Hebrew writer refers to king of righteousness and then also king of Salem, meaning king of peace. The term Salem, it means peace. And so what the Hebrew writer is writing, there's a couple of aspects to this that he's specifically pointing out are important to the understanding of Melchizedek. The fact that he's referred to as king of righteousness, that's what his name means. The fact that he was king of Salem, but even the fact that he was king of Salem was also representative of king of peace. The fact that Abraham gave a tithe. When you go back to Genesis, it just says, and he gave him a tithe of all. Now, we know under the Mosaical law, who gave tithes to whom? Under the Mosaical law. Okay. All the other tribes gave tithes to the tribe of Levi. That's because that was the priesthood. That was the means by which they were supported. Well, the Hebrew writer references this event of tithing taking place even before the Mosaical law existed. And he specifically says that Abraham gave Melchizedek a tithe, a tenth. It wasn't Melchizedek giving Abraham a tenth. It was the other way around. And that's very important as well. Now, when you read king of righteousness and king of peace, who would you automatically equate that to in the New Testament? Jesus, right? He's referenced as king of righteousness. He's referenced as the king of peace. And so it's interesting that the Hebrew writer is making this case about Melchizedek. And then he says in verse 3, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now this is where all kinds of interesting theories start evolving out of commentaries and so forth about this man Melchizedek. You start looking up, you Google or whatever, Melchizedek, you're going to get a whole lot of interesting stuff. There are those who believe, but what the Hebrew writer is saying is that he actually Melchizedek was the same person as Jesus on earth in the Old Testament. Then Jesus went back up to heaven, but then actually fulfilled the prophecy by being born, and then thus was Jesus the Messiah after he came the second time, technically. But there are those who say, see, this is Jesus. He's being described as the king of righteousness, king of peace. He has no father, no mother. That's Jesus. There are some who believe that this is not Jesus, but perhaps the one immortal being who was ever created, other than, as a human, other than beings of heaven. that he's an immortal person. He's not Jesus, but he's like the Jesus figure of the Old Testament. And he's immortal. He doesn't have a father, he doesn't have a mother, he has no lineage, he has no family, and he wasn't created, he wasn't born, and he never dies. Then there are some who suggest that, well, this is talking about Shem, Noah's son. He died at age 600, and they try to line up the timeline and say, this is Shem. I think it would be clear that it was Shem if that was the case. I don't believe that is. His name is Melchizedek. Now, none of those claims have any logical basis, much less scriptural basis. So what do we find then? What's the explanation regarding why the Hebrew writer describes this man in this way in verse 3? Okay. No, I believe that's exactly right. Why don't we have more about Melchizedek? We've got 3 verses. And in those 3 verses, it's all about this dialogue between him and Abraham. We know nothing of his past. We know nothing of his parents. We know nothing of if he had any children, if he was married. We know nothing about him other than he was king, he was priest, and he received a tenth from Abraham. That's it. That's all we know. And so when the Hebrew writer references Melchizedek in verse 3, he's without father. Does that mean he literally was without father? I suggest it's because we have no record of his father. He's without father, without mother. We have no record of his parents. Without genealogy, we have no record of any of his family. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, there's not a recording of when he was born. There's not a recording of him dying. And so in the sense, if of that case, that for our knowledge, there is no information other than that he existed. Thus, he was made like the Son of God. Not that he's immortal, not that he's deity, but rather from the case of history. He continues. Because there's no evidence, there's no record of his ending. And so as long as Melchizedek's record is unending, then his priesthood continues. Because nothing in the old law said anything about ending the previous priesthood in the Mosaical law. Nothing in the Mosaical law made reference to anything of the patriarchal law. And so since the Mosaical law didn't say anything like, now this ends, so ends the priesthood of the patriarchal law. There's none of that. And since there is no record of Melchizedek dying, then there is no record of his priesthood ending. So as a result, this is what's going to come into verse 4 and 5 and 6 in the Hebrew writer's discussion of Melchizedek. Now consider how great this man was. Now notice, what does the Hebrew writer call him? A man. He called him great, but he called him a man. He was human. Okay? Consider how great this man was, to whom even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils. And indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, now we're talking about the Mosaical law, they have a commandment to receive tithes from the people according to the law, that is, from their brethren, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. Because the law allowed for the means by which the tribe of Levi to be supported by everybody else through tithes. And the beautiful thing, the beautiful link that the Hebrew writer makes here is that where did Levi come from ultimately? Who's the father of Levi? When you go back? Abraham. So to whom did Abraham give tithes? Melchizedek. So, in a sense, the tribe of Levi, the priesthood itself under the old law, who they received tithes from the people, Levi gave tithes to Melchizedek, in a sense, even though he was still in the loins of Abraham. Which speaks to what? What is the analogy that the Hebrew writer is going to make here? Verse 7, beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. which goes to show he's making the case that the old law cannot claim to have preeminence. And the priesthood of the old law, the tribe of Levi, cannot claim preeminence. Why? Because even the tribe of Levi, and for that matter, in effect, in symbolism, the entire old law gave tithes to the priesthood of Melchizedek. And if the priesthood of Melchizedek continues, of which Jesus is, according to the order of Melchizedek, then that means the old law is not preeminent. And that's what the Hebrew writer's whole point is. And it's all because of those 3 verses back in Genesis 14. Those 3 verses are what help the Hebrew writer to show that the old law, or the Mosaical law, is subject to the order that God has established. It is not the be-all and end-all. It's subject to the order that God has set. Ben.
Back in verse 4 when it says how great this man was, past tense.
Right.
It shows there's an ending to his life, and then
Sure.
follow that down through the verses.
Yeah, and of course that is the implication.
The law was
Right.
past tense.
Right. And that is the implication. You know, the implication is the Hebrew writer knew full well this was a man, a great man, but still a man, who did die, but we have no record of it. And I guarantee you there will never be a record found of it. In fact, in all of human history, the only record that Melchizedek existed is Genesis 14, 18 through 20. That's it. There will be, I guarantee there will never ever be a tablet found that describes Melchizedek and his lineage. Why? Because this is the Hebrew writer's point. There is no record. There is no record of his life, of what he did. Only those 3 verses in Genesis 14. And it's that way for a reason. There's a reason why God, in the middle of a context of Abram going out and meeting with the king of Sodom and giving the king of Sodom back his goods that were taken, you have right dab there in the middle of this, those 3 verses about Melchizedek. God wanted it there for this purpose, to make, so that the Hebrew writer one day could make this case, and that's it. To me, this is the beauty of foresight, the beauty of the foreknowledge of God in having Moses and write down everything that had happened, but then only those 3 verses about Melchizedek, only so that later in Psalms, a prophecy can be made to Jesus that you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Then that could be taken by the Hebrew writer to make the case that the Mosaical law does not have preeminence. It's just beautiful. I mean, it sends shivers up your back when you think about the wisdom and foresight of God. It's amazing. So in verse 5, when he says, "Indeed, those who are of the sons of Levi who receive the priesthood have a commandment to receive tithes. They come from the loins of Abraham," verse 6, "but he whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises." Abraham had the promises. Our father Abraham, even though Abraham wasn't of the Mosaical law, the Jews took their roots back to Abraham. And yet, notice it says, from them they received tithes from Abraham. Abraham yielded tithes to someone greater, at least in the hierarchy that God had established under the patriarchal law, to Melchizedek. And blessed him, then Melchizedek blessed him who had the promises. As if Melchizedek was in a position to bless Abraham. Not the other way around. It wasn't Abraham blessing Melchizedek. It was Melchizedek blessing Abraham. Which again shows that there was someone greater in terms of authority than Abraham, even in Abraham's time. Melchizedek had authority. Melchizedek had the ability to bless Abraham, while Abraham, he was the father of the Jews. He was the receiver of the promises of God. and yet he received a blessing from Melchizedek. That is the beauty of the case that the Hebrew writer is making. Beyond all contradiction, the lesser is blessed by the better. Beyond all contradiction. It cannot be contested. You cannot argue this any other way. It's not, you can't reinterpret this. The lesser, that's Abraham, is blessed by the better, that's Melchizedek. In terms of the authority of the hierarchy that God had established under the patriarchal law. Here, verse 8, mortal men receive tithes, but there he receives them, of whom it is witnessed that he lives. Notice how the Hebrew writer makes the case of the witness that Melchizedek existed. It was because he received tithes from Abraham. Those 3 little verses that show that he existed, but that's it. Of whom it is witnessed that he lives. That's it. Not that he was born or that he died or anything else, but that he was alive. Even Levi, verse 9, who receives tithes, Levi, of course, by the symbolism there that all the tribe of Levi, the priesthood received tithes from the rest of the people, therefore Levi receives the tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, so to speak, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. Even the fathers, even Levi, paid tithes to Melchizedek. The lesser is blessed by the better. Thoughts or comments through verse 10 so far? Yes, sir.
Well, it had to be another sticking point with the Jews because the Mosaic law had the Levitical priesthood. This guy is from Jerusalem, but that's before Jews received that promised land.
Right.
So you've got someone who's a non-Jew.
A Gentile.
Who's being blessed, getting the tithes from Abraham.
Yeah.
Where Abraham seed. Well, there was somebody greater than him. To the Jews, that's going to hurt.
That's gonna hurt some feelings, isn't it? Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, that connection to Salem or Jerusalem, the fact that he was a king and a priest, and the fact that here's a Gentile being paid tithes by our father Abraham, or being given tithes by our father Abraham. Talk about a sticking point for the Jews. That's probably not something they really wanted to look too closely at. But again, it goes back to, if God had Moses devote an entire chapter or several chapters to Melchizedek, or that event of just them getting together in those 3 verses there, if that had been a whole chapter, then it might have been harder to go unnoticed by the Jews. But it's only 3 verses. So it would have been easy for the Jews to kind of just skip over that part and not really think about the implications of what happened there. The Hebrew writer then takes it and literally breaks it down almost verse by verse of those 3 verses and says, now think about what this means. Think about the implications here for the superiority of the old law or Mosaical law. It doesn't have superiority. It doesn't have preeminence. Something existed before this that had preeminence. And that's part of what he's going to later on connect to at the end of chapter 7. On your notes, I apologize, you can cross out those first 3 points on character. Obviously, those were accidentally left on there from the notes from Lot. I used the same template, and then I typed my stuff in for my notes. So obviously, those first 3 chose the well-watered portion. The land could not support them. There was strife whilst living in Sodom was taken captive. And so those are all about Lot. So you can just mark those off. I didn't catch that before I printed them. But then we get to Genesis 14, 18 through 20. We see that he was priest of Most High God. He was king of Salem. He was king of Jerusalem. But the Hebrew writer specifically carries out the symbolism of the fact that means peace, and that means something. Melchizedek blessed Abram. And then in Psalm 110, we see the messianic prophecy. Psalm 110 and in verse 4, and even though the Hebrew writer is going to quote it, we're going to go back to it real quick. Psalm 110, we're going to start in verse 1. Psalm 110 and in verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Does that one sound familiar? Do we know that is about the Messiah? That's quoted in the New Testament, isn't it? By the apostles about being about Jesus. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. And of course, you break down what Lord is what Lord here. The Lord said to my Lord. Well, who is David's Lord? The Lord said to my Lord. There's a hierarchy here. There's one at the very top. There's one right beneath him. And then there's David. David says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. So who's speaking? Paul even brings this up in 1 Corinthians 15. It's God the Father. Okay? God the Father there in verse 1. The Lord.
It's David speaking, but he's
Well,
talking about God.
Right, but this is what he said. This is what the Father, Jehovah, said to Jesus. All right, we'll stop there with Psalm 110. We'll pick up here and hopefully finish up Melchizedek next week. Thank you, everybody.